Imagine you're a senior national security official in Washington, and your phone lights up at 2 in the morning with 3 alerts arriving back to back. The first tells you that Riyadh and Washington have just announced a breakthrough in civil nuclear cooperation, a joint declaration setting the legal foundation for long-term collaboration. The second tells you that OPEC Plus has quietly locked in a plan keeping oil supply cuts running well into the following year. The third, and this is the one that keeps you awake, comes from every serious think tank simultaneously, and the message is the same. This is not a breakup. It is a renegotiation. And renegotiations, by definition, mean the old deal is no longer working. For decades, the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia operated on a logic so simple it barely needed to be spoken aloud. Washington provided the security umbrella, Riyadh provided oil market stability. Both sides smiled in the photographs and went home satisfied. It was not a friendship built on shared values, it was a contract built on overlapping interests. And for a long time, it held, but the world those interests were built on no longer exists. Regional wars have scrambled the threat map. The global energy transition is quietly eroding the leverage that oil once provided. China has inserted itself into Middle Eastern diplomacy in ways that would have seemed impossible a generation ago. Saudi Arabia is in the middle of an identity transformation so ambitious, it has rebranded an entire country around a single document called Vision 2030. And the United States, tangled in its own domestic politics, can no longer write the kind of blank checks that made the old alliance so clean and simple. What is happening between Washington and Riyadh right now is not a divorce. It is something more complicated, and in many ways more consequential. It is the rewiring of one of the most important strategic relationships on the planet, happening in real time, hidden inside press statements, arms sale negotiations, nuclear cooperation frameworks, and very carefully worded joint declarations. To understand it, you have to start with what the deal always actually was. The strongest argument for those who insist nothing has fundamentally changed goes like this. The United States still needs Gulf stability, Saudi Arabia still needs American military technology and deterrence, and therefore the alliance endures. That argument is not wrong. Endures is probably the right word. But endures is not the same as unchanged. What has shifted, quietly and structurally, is the pricing model of the entire relationship, what each side is willing to pay, and what counts as payment. One of the biggest misunderstandings surrounding this alliance is that a security guarantee between two governments functions like a subscription service. You sign up, and you are covered. The reality is far messier. Congressional Research Service analysis has laid out plainly that any formal US security commitment to Saudi Arabia would need to track closely with constitutional processes, which is a polite way of saying that automatic protection is not on the table. Saudi officials want something predictable. American officials can only offer something politically survivable. That gap between what Riyadh needs and what Washington can legally deliver is the engine of recalibration. And nowhere did that gap become more visible than on a single morning in September 2019. You are in eastern Saudi Arabia. You are not near a military base. You are near the single most important piece of oil infrastructure on the planet, the Abqaiq processing facility, where crude oil gets refined into something the global economy can actually use. Then the sky starts delivering precision strikes. Drones and cruise missiles hitting coordinated waves. Within hours, roughly half of Saudi Arabia's oil production capacity is knocked offline. The shock is not just the damage, it is the message. The most important energy infrastructure on Earth just proved it is not untouchable. What happened next is what strategists now describe carefully as the moment security guarantees revealed their fine print. The response from Washington was cautious, measured, constrained by escalation risk, legal frameworks, domestic politics, and the near-universal fear in American foreign policy circles of being pulled into another Middle Eastern conflict. This was not a failure of will. It was the structural reality of how democracies make decisions about the use of force. But from Riyadh's perspective, the lesson was unmistakable. The American deterrence umbrella is real, but it comes with deductibles. And when the bill arrives in the middle of a crisis, the fine print matters enormously. Saudi Arabia responded by doing exactly what rational actors do when they discover their insurance policy has gaps. They began diversifying their coverage. The most visible signal of this came in March 2023. when Saudi Arabia and Iran announced the restoration of diplomatic relations following talks hosted in Beijing. For Washington's foreign policy community, it landed like a thunderclap. China, not the United States, had brokered the most significant diplomatic shift in the Gulf in years. The reaction in much of the Western press was to frame this as evidence that the US-Saudi alliance was crumbling. That reading missed the actual mechanics almost entirely. Saudi Arabia did not pursue the Iran deal because it trusts Iran. It pursued it because continued hostility was becoming expensive in ways that directly threatened the country's most important national project. Every drone launched from Yemeni territory towards Saudi infrastructure is not just a security incident. It is a line item in the budget for Vision 2030. It is a risk premium on every foreign investment conversation. It is a reason for a global corporation to look at a different location for its regional headquarters. Riyadh's move toward de-escalation was not idealism, it was cost control. And that brings us to the transformation that is driving nearly every dimension of Saudi foreign policy right now. Vision 2030 is Saudi Arabia's attempt to do in one generation what most countries take a century to accomplish. Break an almost total dependency on a single commodity and build a diversified modern economy capable of surviving in a post-oil world. Massive tourism infrastructure, advanced manufacturing, artificial intelligence, investment, sports and entertainment industries, futuristic city projects designed to signal to global capital that Saudi Arabia is not just an oil producer with ambitions, it is a destination for the world's money and talent. But here is the paradox that sits at the heart of it. Executing Vision 2030 requires enormous amounts of capital, and in the short to medium term, that capital comes primarily from oil revenues. Saudi Arabia's fiscal break-even oil price, the crude price the government needs just to balance its budget, sits somewhere above $90 per barrel by most serious estimates. When oil prices dip below that level, the pressure on the entire transformation program intensifies immediately. Saudi Aramco, the state oil company that functions as the financial engine behind much of the government's ambitions, paid out dividends totaling the equivalent of roughly $124 billion in 2024. By 2025, with oil prices under pressure and free cash flow shrinking, that figure was expected to drop to somewhere around $85 billion. That is a nearly $40 billion reduction in a single year in the government's primary source of funding for national transformation. When your national project is this capital-intensive and this dependent on investor confidence, your foreign policy stops being purely strategic and starts being, in part, a macro-scale investor relations campaign. Stability is no longer just a diplomatic goal, it is a prerequisite for the business model. And that reframes what Saudi Arabia actually wants from its relationship with the United States. The old model was essentially, give us security and we will provide oil market stability. The new model is more demanding and more specific. Give us security, advanced technology, legal cooperation frameworks, civil nuclear capability, and political credibility with global capital markets, and in return, we will remain anchored within a US-aligned regional order. That is a significantly more complex transaction than the original, and it is why you now see the relationship expressed through itemized packages, defense cooperation frameworks, civil nuclear agreements, economic partnerships rather than a single overarching grand bargain. The nuclear track is, in many ways, the clearest window into how this new relationship actually functions. Saudi Arabia wants nuclear energy for reasons that are partly practical and partly strategic. On the practical side, burning oil domestically to generate electricity is increasingly seen as burning money. Every barrel used at home is a barrel not exported at global prices. Nuclear baseload power frees up that oil for sale. On the strategic side, a civil nuclear program signals industrial sophistication, long-term state capacity, and technological modernity in ways that matter enormously for attracting the kind of investment Vision 2030 requires. But under US law, meaningful nuclear cooperation requires a formal legal agreement, what policy circles call a 123 agreement, named for the relevant section of the Atomic Energy Act. This framework establishes conditions around safeguards, inspections, and critically, restrictions on enrichment. And enrichment is where the entire negotiation becomes a minefield. The technology used to enrich uranium for civilian reactor fuel is, at higher concentrations, the same technology that produces material for nuclear weapons. Saudi officials have signaled a desire to enrich uranium domestically. American officials and non-proliferation experts hear that request through the lens of regional security dynamics, particularly given Iran's own nuclear trajectory, and the answer from Washington has consistently been that enrichment is the red line. By late 2025, a joint declaration announced that negotiations had produced a legal foundation for long-term civil nuclear cooperation. Arms control analysts noted that the declaration existed while the most sensitive details, including the enrichment question, remained publicly unresolved. This is the alliance's new operating mode: advance into new domains, establish legal frameworks, and leave the most explosive specifics locked in a room that neither side is ready to open in public. Running through every one of these dynamics is a third actor that rarely appears in the official photographs but is present in every calculation: China. The strongest version of the argument that China is replacing the United States in the Gulf points to a simple set of facts. China is Saudi Arabia's largest trading partner. Chinese investment in Gulf infrastructure has grown substantially, and it was Beijing, not Washington, that hosted the Saudi-Iran normalization talks in 2023. That is not nothing, but trading partner and security guarantor are different categories of relationship, and confusing them is the central error in most coverage of China's Gulf ambitions. Saudi Arabia's military architecture, its aircraft, its missile defense systems, its intelligence integration, its command relationships, its maintenance and spare parts supply chains is built around American and Western systems accumulated over decades. You do not switch that the way you switch streaming services. You cannot download a new security ecosystem. China can deepen economic ties with Saudi Arabia. China can facilitate diplomatic conversations in a low-pressure environment. What China cannot currently do is deploy a credible forward military presence in the Gulf, offer the interoperability of decades of joint operations, or provide the deterrence architecture that Saudi Arabia's threat environment actually demands. What China actually gives Saudi Arabia is leverage. The existence of a credible alternative economic and diplomatic partner changes the negotiating dynamic with Washington. Saudi officials can walk into American meetings with the implicit message that other options exist, which makes the United States more attentive and more willing to discuss terms seriously. That is not switching sides. That is sophisticated bargaining, and it is a direct driver of recalibration on the American side, which now must think about what it is actually offering in exchange for Saudi alignment, rather than simply assuming alignment as the default. This dynamic became most visible and most politically explosive around the question of Israeli normalization. Through much of 2023, Washington was working toward what it hoped would be a historic regional realignment. Saudi Arabia recognizing Israel, unlocking a new architecture of US-aligned Gulf states, and delivering a strategic victory of enormous proportions. The logic was coherent. Quiet cooperation between Gulf governments and Israel already existed in various domains. State interests tend to reassert themselves over time, and Saudi leadership had demonstrated a consistent willingness to make pragmatic decisions when the strategic calculus was clear. Then October 2023 arrived, and nothing about the calculus was clear anymore. The Gaza war did not just make normalization politically difficult, it made it, for the foreseeable term, politically unaffordable. Saudi Arabia announced publicly in early 2024 that it would not establish diplomatic relations with Israel, absent the creation of a Palestinian state along the 1,967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. That statement was not rhetorical. It formalized what had been a negotiating position into a public red line, which is far harder to walk back. What this did to the US-Saudi relationship was force a structural change. The normalization track had been conceived as a kind of grand synthesis. A single deal that would lock in a regional order, deliver security commitments to Riyadh, and cement American influence across the Gulf for a generation. When that synthesis stalled, the relationship had to reorganize around smaller, separate modules: defense here, nuclear cooperation there, economic framework somewhere else. The big picture deal gave way to a portfolio of smaller, more conditional arrangements. And threading through all of it is the reality that every American administration must navigate. Congress is always in the room. Treaty-style security guarantees require Senate ratification. Advanced arms sales face congressional scrutiny that can block or delay transfers for months or years. Civil nuclear cooperation must pass through the legal framework of the Atomic Energy Act. Any formal commitment that reads like an automatic military obligation will face fierce resistance from legislators who watched 2 decades of Middle Eastern military entanglement and drew their own conclusions. Saudi officials have learned to treat American political commitments the way experienced investors treat earnings forecasts. Useful as a signal of intent, but subject to revision based on conditions that neither party fully controls. An election can change the composition of Congress. A crisis can shift public opinion. A domestic political movement can transform what is politically survivable into what is politically suicidal. The result is that Saudi Arabia builds hedges not because it distrusts the United States specifically, but because it distrusts any single point of dependency in a world where political weather changes fast. The threat environment itself has added another layer of complexity that neither side fully anticipated. The attack on Abqaiq revealed something that defense planners now reckon with constantly. The economics of modern asymmetric warfare heavily favor the attacker. An interceptor missile costs millions. The drone it shoots down can cost $20,000. When that exchange rate operates at scale across a sustained campaign, even a well-defended country faces serious attrition pressure. Saudi Arabia does not just need more hardware. It needs layered, integrated defensive architecture spanning early warning systems, electronic warfare, point defense, and long-range interceptors. And that architecture, at its most sophisticated level, remains deeply tied to American systems, doctrine, and operational experience. This creates the alliance's central paradox in the defense domain. The deeper Saudi Arabia integrates with American military systems, the more dependent it becomes, and the more it wants to escape that dependency. Vision 2030 explicitly includes ambitions for domestic defense industry development. Saudi officials push for technology transfer as a condition of major arms deals. The long-term goal is a country capable of sustaining its own security rather than relying indefinitely on external supply chains. Washington watches this with a specific kind of wariness. Advanced technology transfer is a genuinely sensitive issue when the recipient also maintains deepening economic ties with a strategic competitor. The United States does not want to arm a partner that might, directly or indirectly, expose sensitive capabilities to an adversary, so the defense relationship becomes more conditional, more monitored, and more explicitly structured around compliance and end-use requirements. Less a friendship, more a managed transaction with audits. What you are watching unfold between Washington and Riyadh is the slow, complicated, often frustrating process of 2 governments rewriting a contract that was designed for a world that no longer exists. The original deal was elegant in its simplicity. The new one is not elegant at all. It is a portfolio of overlapping frameworks, modular agreements, conditional commitments, and carefully negotiated legal structures that together approximate what the old handshake once delivered. The alliance is not ending, but the era of operating on assumptions alone is definitively over. Every significant move now requires explicit terms, documented frameworks, and legal structures capable of surviving changes in government on both sides. The Civil Nuclear Declaration, the defense cooperation packages, the OPEC Plus compliance schedules, the normalization conditions. These are not the outputs of a warm alliance. They are the outputs of a relationship that has moved from trust to contract, from grand bargain to itemized billing. Whether this new structure proves more durable than the old one or more brittle at moments of crisis depends entirely on whether both sides can consistently answer a question that neither will ever say out loud in a press conference. Are we still getting what we paid for? And in a world where oil no longer defines the relationship the way it once did, where China offers an alternative set of partners without lectures, where nuclear energy has become a proxy for national ambition, and where domestic politics on both sides makes open-ended commitment nearly impossible, that question has no easy answer, which leaves only one worth asking. If the most consequential strategic alliance in the modern Middle East is being rewritten right now, in real time, hidden inside legal frameworks and joint declarations and carefully worded press releases, who exactly is writing the version that serves ordinary people on both sides of it?